On a crisp autumn morning, when the sun was just beginning to warm the sidewalks of Cedar Street, James Richardson followed his weekly ritual at May's Diner. The small bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open, greeting him like an old friend. The aroma of fresh coffee and warm pancakes filled the air as he made his way to his usual spot, the corner booth by the window where the morning light created the perfect glow for his Wednesday tradition. The regulars at May's barely looked up anymore when James spread out his small velvet cloth on the table. They were used to seeing the 58-year-old Marine Corps veteran meticulously arranging his service medals every Wednesday morning. It was his way of keeping them polished and remembering the brothers and sisters he'd served with over his 20 years in uniform. Today, though, felt different. Maybe it was the way the morning light caught the silver star, making it shimmer more than usual, or perhaps it was the new faces he'd noticed walking past the diner's large windows. James carefully positioned each medal, remembering the stories behind them. The Purple Hearts, 3 of them, each carried memories of moments when he put his life on the line for his fellow Marines. The Silver Star reminded him of that night in the desert, when leadership meant making split-second decisions that saved his entire unit. As he worked, Clara, the diner's longtime waitress, brought over his usual order without him having to ask. Black coffee, 2 sugars, and whole wheat toast. "Looking extra shiny today, James," she said with a warm smile, setting down his breakfast. James looked up from his work, his weathered face breaking into a gentle grin. "Thank you, Clara. Something about today just feels like they need an extra bit of care." The morning crowd was starting to filter in. Construction workers grabbing their breakfast burritos, office workers clutching their phones while ordering coffee to go, and a few elderly couples who'd been coming to May's even longer than James had. The diner had that comfortable buzz of conversation and clinking plates that made it feel like home. James was so focused on his task, carefully polishing the brass and silver surfaces of his medals, that he didn't immediately notice the police cruiser that pulled up outside. He was using small, careful circles with his polishing cloth on his combat action ribbon when the bell above the door chimed again, this time announcing the arrival of 2 uniformed officers he'd never seen before. The younger of the 2 officers scanned the diner with the kind of scrutiny that comes from being new to the job and eager to prove himself. His partner, slightly older but still unfamiliar with this part of town, followed his gaze. Their eyes settled on James, taking in his worn jeans and faded t-shirt, making quick judgments that would soon prove to be terribly mistaken. As James continued his careful work, unaware of the attention he was drawing, he hummed softly to himself, an old Marine Corps hymn that had become as much a part of his Wednesday routine as the medal polishing itself. The medals gleamed in the morning light, each one telling a story of sacrifice, courage, and service that the approaching officers couldn't yet see. Clara watched from behind the counter, her hand pausing mid-wipe of a coffee mug, as the 2 officers began making their way toward James's corner booth. The regular customers, who knew James and his weekly ritual, also started to notice the tension building in the air. The gentle murmur of morning conversation began to quiet, like the calm before a storm. The stage was set for a moment that would change not just one morning at May's Diner, but the way an entire community would come to understand each other. And it all began with those few precious seconds before the officers reached James's table while he was still lost in thought, carefully tending to the symbols of his service to a country that hadn't always served him equally in return. Officer Brady approached James's table first, his boots making sharp sounds against the diner's tiled floor. The morning chatter had died down to a tense whisper, with only the soft clinking of coffee cups and the sizzle of the grill breaking the silence. Clara stood frozen behind the counter, her experienced eyes reading the room like a book she'd seen too many times before. "Sir, we've had some reports of suspicious activity in this area," Officer Brady said, his voice carrying that practiced authority that new officers often use to mask their uncertainty. His hand rested casually on his belt, too close to his radio for comfort. James looked up slowly from his medals, his fingers still holding the polishing cloth mid-stroke. Officer Mitchell stood slightly behind his partner, taking in the scene with growing discomfort. His eyes darted between James's calm face and the gleaming metals spread out on the velvet cloth. Something about this didn't feel right to him. But he stayed quiet, following his partner's lead as protocol demanded. "Can you explain what you're doing here?" Brady continued, gesturing at the metals with his chin. The question hung in the air like heavy smoke, making several regular customers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Mr. Johnson, a retired schoolteacher who'd been coming to Mays for 30 years, gripped his coffee cup so tight his knuckles turned white. James set down his polishing cloth with deliberate slowness. 20 years in the Marines had taught him how to handle tense situations with grace. "I'm having breakfast," he replied simply, his voice steady and clear. "And maintaining my service medals, as I do every Wednesday morning." Brady's posture stiffened slightly. "These are yours." The doubt in his voice was unmistakable, making several customers exchange glances. May herself emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a mix of concern and determination. "Every single one," James answered, still keeping his voice level. "Earned them over 20 years in the Marine Corps. Would you like to know the story behind any of them?" The offer was genuine, without a hint of sarcasm or challenge. A young woman at the counter had pulled out her phone, recording the interaction with trembling hands. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the silver star just right, making it flash like a signal mirror. Officer Mitchell's eyes were drawn to it, and something in his expression changed. "That's a silver star," Mitchell said quietly, almost to himself. His father had one just like it, kept in a glass case above the fireplace. Brady turned slightly, catching his partner's change in tone. James nodded, picking up the medal carefully. "Operation Desert Shield. My unit was pinned down outside Fallujah. Sometimes leadership means making impossible decisions." His words carried weight without bitterness, heavy with memories, but free of anger. The tension in the air began to shift, like a weather front breaking. Officer Brady's hand moved away from his belt, his posture softening almost imperceptibly. The regular customers watched as understanding slowly dawned on the young officer's face. May stepped forward then, coffee pot in hand like a peace offering. "Officers, would you like some coffee?" James here has been polishing his medals at this same table every Wednesday for 5 years. He's as much a part of this place as our apple pie. The hum of normal diner conversation began to return, though I still watched the scene unfold. James reached for another medal, a Purple Heart, and held it up to the light. "This one has quite a story too, if you care to hear it. Sometimes the best understanding comes from sharing our experiences." The moment balanced on a knife's edge. It could still tip either way. But there was something in James's steady gaze and quiet dignity that seemed to reach past badges and assumptions, speaking to something more fundamental about respect, service, and the bridges that need building in every community. Clara resumed wiping down the counter, but her eyes never left the scene. The young woman with the phone slowly lowered it, sensing that this story might have a different ending than she'd initially feared. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the medals on the table, symbols of service that were about to become tools for understanding. Officer Mitchell stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the Purple Heart in James's hand. The morning light caught the medal's surface, reflecting the same kind of Purple Heart pin he'd seen countless times on his father's old uniform. The diner had fallen into a comfortable quiet, the kind that comes when people sense they're witnessing something important. "My father wore one of those," Mitchell said softly, pulling out a chair and sitting down without waiting for an invitation. Brady remained standing, but his stance had changed, less authoritative now, more uncertain. James smiled gently, turning the medal so Mitchell could see it better. "Afghanistan, 2008. James began, his deep voice carrying the weight of memories. "Our convoy hit an IED. Lost 2 good men that day, saved 3 others." He paused, letting the words sink in. The regular customers listened intently, even those who'd heard the story before. There was something different about hearing it now, in this context. May appeared with fresh coffee cups for the officers, setting them down with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd served thousands of breakfasts, but knew this one was special. The steam rose between the three men like a gentle barrier being lifted. Dad never talked much about his, Mitchell said, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. Always said some stories are harder to tell than others. James nodded, understanding filling his eyes. Brady slowly pulled out another chair, his earlier suspicion replaced by something that looked like shame. That's often true, James replied, carefully placing the Purple Heart back on its velvet bed. But sometimes the hardest stories are the ones that need telling most. He reached for another medal, this one reflecting his 20 years of dedicated service. Clara moved around the diner, refilling coffee cups, but she kept one ear on the conversation. The young woman who'd been recording earlier had put her phone away completely, now fully engaged in the scene unfolding before her. The morning sun had risen higher, casting longer shadows across the diner's checkered floor. I work with young people now, James continued, his voice warming with pride, down at the community center on Pine Street, teaching them about service, respect, understanding, the things that really matter. He looked directly at both officers. You know, we could always use more mentors who understand both sides of the badge. Brady spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice carrying a different kind of authority now, the kind that comes from humility. I think we owe you an apology, sir. The sir came naturally this time, respect replacing suspicion. James waved off the apology with a gentle hand. What we owe each other is understanding. Those kids I work with, they need to see that moments like this can end differently than they expect. That assumptions can be broken, bridges can be built. The diner had returned to its normal breakfast rhythm, but something had shifted in the air. Mr. Johnson at the counter was smiling into his coffee cup. May was humming as she worked the grill, the sound mixing with the gentle clink of James's medals as he began carefully arranging them back in their case. The center's open every Tuesday and Thursday evening, James said, closing the velvet cloth with practiced care. We could always use some officers who understand the value of both service and learning. He pulled a simple business card from his wallet. Nothing fancy, just his name and the center's address. Mitchell took the card, turning it over in his hands as if it held more than just printed information. Brady nodded slowly, seeming to understand that this morning had offered them something more valuable than any patrol could have. As the officers stood to leave, James remained seated, his medals now safely packed away. The morning sun had fully claimed the diner, washing everything in a warm light that seemed to soften edges and blur boundaries. Outside, the city was waking up to another day, unaware that in this small corner of it, something important had just happened. A reminder that understanding often comes from the most unexpected moments, served up with a side of breakfast and a healthy portion of respect. The rest of that Wednesday morning took on a different feel at May's diner. The regulars who had witnessed the encounter kept stealing glances at James's table, their faces showing a mix of pride and relief. The young woman who had been recording earlier approached James's table, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I thought this was going to be another one of those videos, she said softly, clutching her phone. You know, the kind that make people angry and sad. James looked up at her, his weathered face creasing into a gentle smile. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that surprise us, he replied, gesturing for her to take a seat. The morning rush had settled into the quieter period between breakfast and lunch. Clara moved between tables with a coffee pot, but she lingered near enough to hear as James began telling the young woman about his work at the community center. She'd heard these stories before, but they never got old. We've got kids there who've never had a positive interaction with a police officer, James explained, his fingers absently tracing the outline of his metal case. And we've got officers who've never sat down and really listened to these kids' stories. That's where change begins, in those moments of real connection. The young woman pulled out a small notebook from her bag. "I run a local blog," she explained, her voice gaining confidence. "Would you mind if I wrote about what happened here today? Not the confrontation part, but what came after. People need to hear these stories too." May appeared at the table with a fresh slice of apple pie. "On the house," she insisted. The sweet cinnamon smell mixed with the lingering aroma of coffee as James considered the request. "Stories have power," he said finally. "They can build walls or bridges. It all depends on how we tell them." Outside the diner's windows, life continued its normal flow. A school bus passed by, filled with chattering children. A mail carrier made their rounds, waving at familiar faces through the diner's window. But inside, something special was taking shape, a story of understanding that would soon ripple out into the community. "You know," James continued, warming to the subject, "those officers reminded me of some of the young Marines I used to train. Sometimes the toughest part of leadership is learning to see past our first impressions." He paused, taking a thoughtful bite of pie. "It's about having the courage to let your perspective be changed." The young woman wrote quickly in her notebook, her earlier tears replaced by a look of determination. Clara stopped by again, this time staying to add her own observations about how James had been coming to the diner for years, how his Wednesday morning ritual had become a part of the place's identity. "It's not just about polishing medals," Clara said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had watched life unfold from behind a diner counter for decades. "It's about keeping memories alive and using them to build something better." The conversation flowed naturally, touching on James's work with young people, his hopes for the community, and the small ways that understanding could grow from unexpected moments like this morning's encounter. The young woman's notebook filled with quotes and observations, but more importantly, with the feeling of possibility that hung in the air. As the lunch crowd began to trickle in, James carefully packed away his medals for another week. The young woman thanked him, promising to share the story with the respect it deserved. May watched from behind the counter, knowing that her diner had just become more than just a place for good food. It had become a setting for a story of change. The morning's tension had transformed into something else entirely, a reminder that even in moments of misunderstanding, there was always the potential for growth, for connection, for the kind of change that starts small but ripples outward in ways no one can predict. The following Thursday evening, the community center on Pine Street buzzed with its usual after-school energy. Kids gathered around tables doing homework. The sound of basketball shoes squeaking on the gym floor echoed through the halls, and James sat in his small office, reviewing plans for the week's mentoring sessions. A knock on his open door made him look up. There, still in their uniforms but looking notably less certain than they had in the diner, stood Officers Brady and Mitchell. The hallway behind them fell quiet as several teenagers noticed the unexpected visitors, their young faces showing a mix of curiosity and caution. "You actually came," James said warmly, standing to greet them. His smile was genuine, reaching all the way to his eyes. "Most people take the card, but never follow through." Brady shifted his weight, glancing at the photos on James's office walls, pictures of kids graduating, receiving awards, and smiling with their mentors. "That young woman's blog post," Mitchell explained, his voice soft. "It went kind of viral in our department. The chief read it this morning." He paused, looking at his partner. "He suggested we might learn something here." James nodded, understanding the unspoken words. Through the office window, he could see the kids in the main room trying not to stare while stealing glances at the officers. Some of them had their phones out, but instead of recording, they were showing each other something. The blog post, James realized. "Perfect timing," James said, grabbing his jacket. "We're starting a new program tonight. Building bridges, that's what we call it." He led them out of the office, into the main room where about 20 young people sat in a loose circle of chairs. The basketball game in the corner had stopped, all eyes now focused on the unexpected scene unfolding. "Everyone," James announced, his voice carrying the same quiet authority it had in the diner. These are Officers Mitchell and Brady. They're here to listen and to share. He gestured to two empty chairs in the circle. And maybe to learn something, just like the rest of us. The silence in the room felt heavy with possibility. One of the older teens, a tall boy wearing his basketball jersey, spoke first. "Are you the officers from the diner?" From the story. His voice carried no accusation, just genuine curiosity. Mitchell nodded, taking the seat. "Yes, we are. And we're here because sometimes the best way to fix a mistake is to learn from it." Brady followed his partner's lead, sitting down in the circle. The tension in the room began to shift, like ice beginning to thaw. James watched as the kids exchanged glances, some nodding slightly, others still uncertain but willing to listen. He'd seen this moment before, the moment when barriers could either strengthen or start to crumble. It all depended on what happened next. "Let's start with a story," James suggested, taking his own seat in the circle. "But this time, let's all tell it together. Because every person here has a perspective that matters, a voice that needs to be heard." He looked around the circle, meeting each pair of eyes, including the officers. "Who wants to begin?" A hand went up, one of the younger kids, usually quiet during these sessions. And as they began to talk, something remarkable started to happen. The basketball players drifted over from the court. The kids doing homework set down their pencils. Even the usually distracted teenagers put away their phones. In that moment, the community center became more than just a building on Pine Street. It became a space where understanding could grow, where stories could change, and where badges and backgrounds mattered less than the willingness to listen and learn. The evening light filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the floor. But in that circle, something bright was beginning to take shape, a reminder that sometimes the best changes start with a simple willingness to sit down together and really hear each other's stories. The community center session flowed naturally as stories began to unfold. The young boy who raised his hand first shared his experience of being scared whenever he saw a police car in his neighborhood. His voice trembled slightly, but he kept speaking, encouraged by the supportive nods around the circle. Officer Mitchell listened intently, his hands clasped in his lap. When the boy finished, Mitchell shared a story of his own, about being a rookie cop, scared on his first night patrol, realizing that fear could make anyone act differently than they should. The honesty in his voice caught everyone's attention. A teenage girl spoke next, her basketball still clutched in her hands like a security blanket. She talked about her grandmother's restaurant being robbed last year, how surprised she was when two officers stayed after their shift to help clean up the mess, refusing payment for their time. "That's when I realized," she said, bouncing the ball softly, "that we can't judge anyone without knowing their whole story." Brady shifted in his chair, clearly moved by the conversations. His usual stern expression had softened, especially when one of the older teens described wanting to become a police officer himself, but feeling torn because of what his friends might think. "It's like being pulled in two different directions," the teen explained, his words resonating with many in the room. James watched it all unfold, occasionally guiding the conversation, but mostly letting the natural flow of dialogue work its magic. He noticed how the kids who usually sat at the back of the room had gradually moved closer, drawn in by the authentic exchange happening in front of them. "You know what's funny?" Brady spoke up, surprising everyone with his suddenly personal tone. "This morning at the diner, I thought I was doing my job. But sitting here now, I realize I was just following a script someone else had written for me." He paused, looking around the circle. "Tonight, I'm learning how to write a new one." The basketball players had completely abandoned their game by now, fully engaged in the discussion. Even the usual whispers and giggles that filled the center had died down, replaced by an atmosphere of genuine attention and respect. As the evening progressed, James brought out some snacks, cookies and juice that May had sent over from the diner. The simple act of sharing food seemed to break down even more barriers. Officers and teens found themselves reaching for cookies from the same plate, their conversations becoming more relaxed and natural. One of the younger kids asked Officer Mitchell about his police car, and soon a small group had gathered by the window, watching as Mitchell explained how the different equipment worked. The fear that had been so visible earlier was melting away, replaced by genuine curiosity and interest. "This is what it's all about," James said quietly to Brady, watching the scene. "Not erasing our differences, but understanding them. Learning to see past the uniform, past the assumptions, to the person underneath." The evening light had faded to dusk outside, but inside the community center, something was brightening. Plans were being made for future sessions, with both officers agreeing to return next week. Some of the teens exchanged contact information with Brady, who had mentioned needing volunteers for a police department community outreach program. As the session wound down, James noticed something remarkable. The usual rush to leave had been replaced by lingering conversations, by kids and officers alike seeming reluctant to end this moment. The natural barriers that had existed just hours ago had started to crumble, replaced by something that looked a lot like hope. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was subtle, like the way trust builds slowly but surely when people take the time to really listen to each other. As James watched the officers saying goodbye to the kids, he knew that this evening would have ripple effects far beyond these walls, spreading out into the community like rings in a pond, touching lives in ways they might never fully know. Over the next few weeks, the community center's Thursday evening sessions became something special. Word spread through the neighborhood, bringing new faces each week. The basketball court still echoed with the sound of bouncing balls, but now police officers in casual clothes often joined the games, their laughter mixing with the teenagers' shouts. Officer Brady, who had once approached James's table with suspicion, now arrived early to help set up chairs. He'd taken to wearing his civilian clothes when off duty, saying it helped the kids see him as just another person. The change in him was visible. His smile came easier. His shoulders carried less tension. One particular Thursday stood out. A local news crew had gotten wind of what was happening at the center. The young blogger's story had sparked interest beyond their small community. James stood in his office, watching through the window as the reporter set up her camera in the main room. "You think this is a good idea?" Mitchell asked, standing beside James. He'd become a regular at the center, often bringing his own teenage son along. All this attention. James nodded slowly, understanding the concern behind the question. "Sometimes good stories need to be told," he replied, fingering the medal in his pocket. He'd started carrying one with him to these sessions, using it as a talking point when needed. Not for fame, but because they give people hope. Show them what's possible. The main room was filling up with its usual Thursday crowd, plus some new faces drawn by the news story. The kids seemed a bit nervous about the camera at first, but soon fell into their normal routines. A group gathered around Brady, who was showing them photos from his recent community policing training. The reporter moved through the room, capturing moments. A police officer helping a young girl with her math homework. Teenagers and officers planning a community basketball tournament. Mitchell's son teaching younger kids how to dribble. But the real story was in the small moments between the camera shots, the natural conversations, the easy laughter, the absence of the tension that had once filled these spaces. "Remember that first night?" Brady asked during a break, watching as kids and officers shared pizza together. "How quiet everyone was. How scared." James nodded, remembering the uncertainty in everyone's eyes that evening. Now, looking around the room, he saw something entirely different. A young teen, who weeks ago would barely look at a police officer, was enthusiastically explaining his science project to Mitchell. Two rookie officers who'd heard about the program were playing chess with some of the older kids, getting thoroughly beaten and laughing about it. The reporter approached James for an interview, but what caught her attention wasn't the prepared statement he'd thought about giving. Instead, it was the natural scene unfolding behind him. A spontaneous discussion between officers and teens about how to improve community relations, with both sides listening intently to each other. "This isn't just a program," James told her, gesturing to the room full of activity. It's proof that when we stop seeing each other as uniforms or stereotypes, when we start seeing each other as people, real change is possible. As the evening wound down, James noticed something that made him smile. The reporter had put down her microphone, forgetting about her story for a moment, as she got caught up in a conversation with a group of teens and officers discussing their plans for a community garden project. The camera kept rolling, capturing these unscripted moments of connection. Officers showing pictures of their kids, teens sharing their dreams for the future, everyone simply being human together. This was the real story, James thought, not the confrontation at the diner, but what had grown from it. Outside, the streetlights were coming on, casting a warm glow through the windows. Inside, the community center hummed with the energy of something special, a reminder that sometimes the best changes happen not through grand gestures, but through small moments of understanding, multiplied over time, spreading hope one conversation at a time. 6 months after that morning at May's Diner, the community had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The diner itself had become a meeting point where officers and residents regularly gathered for coffee and conversation. May had even added a new special to her menu, the Bridge Builder Breakfast, named after what had happened that Wednesday morning. James sat at his usual booth, polishing his medals, but he wasn't alone anymore. Officer Brady sat across from him, sipping coffee and sharing stories about the latest community center successes. At the counter, Officer Mitchell was showing a group of teenagers pictures from their recent community basketball tournament, where police officers and local kids had played together on mixed teams. "You know," James said, carefully working on his silver star, "I never expected that morning to change so much." He looked around the diner, taking in the scene, the easy conversations between officers and residents, the comfortable way people from all walks of life shared tables and stories. The young blogger who'd first shared their story had become a regular at both the diner and the community center. She sat nearby, typing on her laptop, working on a book about community transformation. Her blog had grown into something bigger, featuring stories of positive change from across the city. Clara moved between tables with her coffee pot, smiling at how different things felt now. The morning regulars had grown used to seeing new faces, officers stopping by for breakfast after their night shifts, teenagers grabbing smoothies before school, community leaders meeting to plan new initiatives. "Remember how quiet it got that morning?" Brady asked, watching James work. "Now look at us." He gestured to the lively diner, where the sounds of laughter and friendly conversation filled the air. The fear and tension that had once existed between officers and residents had been replaced by something else: understanding, respect, maybe even friendship. The community center had expanded its programs, now serving as a model for other neighborhoods. Police officers from across the city came to learn from what James, Brady, and Mitchell had built together. The simple act of listening, of sharing stories, and finding common ground had sparked a movement that was spreading beyond their small corner of the city. May emerged from the kitchen, carrying a fresh apple pie. She set it on the counter, the sweet aroma mixing with the morning coffee smell. "Who would have thought," she said, looking around her diner with pride, "that one tense morning could lead to all this?" Outside, the city was waking up to another day. Through the diner's windows, people could see officers and residents greeting each other by name on the street, stopping to chat, sharing quick jokes or friendly waves. The change wasn't just in programs or policies. It was in these small, daily interactions that had once seemed impossible. James finished polishing his last medal, laying it carefully on the velvet cloth. These medals, which had once caused suspicion and misunderstanding, now served as reminders of how stories could bridge divides, how understanding could grow from the most unexpected moments. "You know what the best part is?" Mitchell said, joining them with a fresh cup of coffee. "The kids at the center don't see uniforms anymore. They just see people." James nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The barriers that had once seemed so solid had melted away, replaced by connections that grew stronger with each passing day. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the diner's checkered floor. James looked at his medals one last time before carefully packing them away. They still shone brightly, but now they reflected something new. Not just stories of past service, but promises of a better future, built one conversation, one understanding, one changed heart at a time. The diner buzzed with the energy of a community transformed, the living testament to the power of listening, understanding, and the courage to see beyond first impressions. And it all started with a simple morning ritual, a misunderstanding, and the willingness to build bridges instead of walls.